Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today, January 27th, 2022. I'm excited for our conversation later with Moshe Nelson, Principal Public Sector at Grant Thornton. But before we get underway, I just want to thank our patron members, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group. We also want to thank our organizational members, of which Grant Thornton is one. And as you can see, it's a growing list. So if you're interested in getting involved in ALN activities at the organizational member level, please reach out and we will talk more about how you can get involved. And with that, I will just say, if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat, and we will get that in front of our esteemed panelist, Moshe Nelson. Mike, I'm seeing you're freezing up a little bit, so maybe I will. Okay, well, I'm gonna carry on then. Thanks for being with us, Moshe.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for the invite. It's always great to speak with you all, and I know just participate in these ALN Th events. It's always a fun discussion.
Yeah, and nice. You mentioned that it's something you look forward to in your day, and I can imagine kind of an informal discussion where you can't expect to be, put to too many hard questions. Could be something to look forward to.
Yeah, especially if Mike's internet's freezing up, and I know that all the tough balls maybe put in the chat.
Well, he might have to get that fixed so he can come in overtime and really grill you.
Yeah.
But until then, do you want to start us off today with maybe law enforcement, asset management? And you mentioned some trends that you could discuss or some recent results in the industry or from Grant Thornton's work.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Nick. So just to set the context, a couple of years ago, as many of you all probably know, we set upon developing with ALN and all of its members a national asset leadership strategy, across the U.S. And it was a bold goal, and it was essentially trying to bring and define, all of the industries that would be associated with asset management, and take the construct that's identified in ISO 55000 and apply that within all of the constraints and environments that we experience in the U.S. And it was a great effort. We produced the first NALS document. And what we noticed from that NALS is, there's a lot to be included, right? There are a lot of different sectors that roll up to, asset management, whether that's water, whether that's healthcare, various different types of transportation, infrastructure. And in order to make this, an effective initiative and really impact, the United States in a positive way, in our second implementation of the NALS, we essentially drove down to what our sector asset leadership strategies. And that focuses the effort on applying the principles within ISO 55000 asset management that looks at asset management as a system and how is it used to drive value, right? How is it used to improve the livelihood of citizens, the infrastructure of the United States, and define it within those sectors. So we broke out subgroups, and I was involved in two of the subgroups, one more so than the other, the law enforcement asset management subgroups and working group, and then a healthcare asset subgroup where my colleague Ed Safdie and several others led the development of. So as a product of these two efforts, months long, and representatives from across government, industry, as well as nonprofit, we were able to produce actual results that identify, what are the trends and the pain points that we're experiencing today. And, lo and behold, healthcare and law enforcement, the past year and a half has been a critical area, and I'll get to Boyd's question in a second, has been a critical area of emphasis, with the pandemic. I don't need to dive into why healthcare might be important. And then, within the social changes and realization of injustices for large parts of our community and society. Law enforcement was put front and center, right? So I think it was a sort of an exceptional time to be taking on those two areas in particular. I don't know how I drew that straw. Just kidding. But taking on those areas and saying, how can we utilize the principles of ISO 55000 and asset management in order to advance and improve how assets are measured across these different industries, public sector, nonprofit, and commercial as well. So I'll talk a little bit about the law enforcement asset management SALs, and I think Boyd put a question in the chat that I just saw pop up, so I'll address that now. How has anyone adopted the taxonomy that we've proposed within the NALs? I think was the reference, and then in the subsequent information that was found in the SALs. Well, interestingly enough, some of the stakeholders that were involved in the NALs development, even within the law enforcement community, had later moved into positions of leadership and decision making. That I think the input that was gathered through NALs development and best practice sharing may have been integrated into their own decision making for operations, for operationalizing this work. And when we approached the law enforcement asset management working group, it certainly was a factor of standardization of data, of assets, of collaboration across various stakeholders, Department of Justice, Homeland Security, components within those environments. So you definitely can find an impact from that body of work. And our support is at such a strategic level when we talk about a NALs, that's the intent, right? The intent to put out these ideas and create essentially a baseline of information to reference. So diving into the law enforcement SALs, I'll just hit upon a few different areas that came up as we finalize the report. I think standardization of information and collaboration among components definitely rose up as items that were included in the SALs, and a part of that is the data and the structure and the management and the systems that are used to manage that information across different components. What's apparent is that there is no unifying IT system, if you will, that all components utilize for all of their assets, right? It's a reality that both state and local, as well as federal, asset leaders face. There are multiple systems, multiple information sources that are needed to manage assets, and whether that asset be facilities, or that asset be fleet or property, or if we want to get into digital assets, we can have a separate segment there. There's significant variability. So understanding that, accepting that, and then putting strategies in place to bring together information, to standardize data sets, to increase collaboration, ultimately is a goal that was set out. So let me just catch my breath there, because I don't want this to go off on too much of a tangent. Nick, does that raise any questions from the audience or yourself?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to first start by saying thank you for that kind of overview. So great to hear you lay that all out. As my understanding of asset management has come through the Asset Leadership Network, it makes perfect sense that we need a national asset leadership strategy that does span all sectors because to maximize, to optimize value for the nation, we need to do as much collaboration, standardization, like you said, across many different once siloed or often siloed activities and fields. But it also makes perfect sense that so many people come to asset management in sector specific or even more specific ways. So it makes perfect sense for the implementation to have an awareness that you need a specific strategy for sectors, and to continue to compartmentalize down as far as people want to go in order for the information and the knowledge to be applied most bestly. But to have that overarching strategic level national set of objectives, goals, standards, taxonomy, as Boyd was mentioning. So great points all there. And then I guess I was hoping you might talk a little more. Did you talk about trends in the law enforcement sector specifically?
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump into some trends, and I can continue that stream of consciousness, overall from law enforcement. But let's talk about some trends. I mean, I think there's significant integration of technology and appetite for integration of technology into the law enforcement arena. Right, greater accountability is demanded by the general public, and as well as supported by congressional leaders, and that works from both top down and bottom up reasons. Right, from the bottom up perspective, it enables the law enforcement community to be able to articulate, hey, what's happening on the ground when they are conducting operations, really serving the general public. Right, there's essentially a new mechanism, a new medium to communicate information, which is fantastic. And then from a governance perspective, it also gives a level of accountability and reassurance that the services that are rendered by the law enforcement community can have a level of accountability. Right, so I think that we're at a very unique time in which you're finding legislators and politicians supporting investment in technology in the law enforcement arena, which, if you worked in this business long enough, those opportunities do not come up very often. I mean, infrastructure bill aside, we'll get into that. But for the law enforcement community, it's a very strained community overall, right? They're often facing budget cuts, reductions, and are especially hard hit during times of recession or economic volatility, right? Because in most cases, they're not revenue generating organizations. So I juxtapose that by increased demand of services during times of challenge, right? I mean, that's just a reality that has to be faced. So I think with these trends that we're seeing, appetite for integration of technology, as well as support in broad areas of the spectrum, there creates more, I would say more investment and more appetite for adoption of asset management principles. Now, I was having a conversation with someone just today, and we were talking about this environment, and that law enforcement is often seen as agents and officers in the field, right? Police officers that are conducting operations. Well, a significant aspect of law enforcement are the backbone of law enforcement, the mission support folks, the asset managers, who have to ensure that individuals can have the equipment they need to conduct their jobs. And I think what we have seen during the pandemic is a realization of the importance of that back office function to enabling the operators. Now, personal protective equipment was essentially a driving factor of that trust building, right? Because literally the lives of these individuals were put in the hands of people to get proper equipment, proper PPE to conduct operations, particularly before you had a vaccine available, in many cases. So that respirator was a lifesaver for many thousands of individuals across the nation. The asset managers were those in charge of procuring, supplying, managing, distributing that information, and enabling the community to be able to conduct their services in a safe and secure fashion. And many did lose their lives, caught up in that mix. So I'll pause there.
Hey, Great. And it's just amazing how good an example law enforcement is of kind of both ends of the spectrum, the very high level strategic theoretical side of things, supporting down to the people on the ground who are risking their lives and saving lives, and just how important it is to have things like supply chain taken into account at the high level to support the people, again, on the ground. And I'm just amazed by how good your description is at highlighting the need for an overlying idea like ISO 55000 or a NALS or a sector asset leadership strategy to increasing the performance and the work environment and the value that both the stakeholders, the community members are getting from a service or, thing like law enforcement, and also increasing the value that an organization is seeing by having that assurance, saying, look, we're covering our bases, our risk management is based on this kind of large idea that's internationally recognized, that, is created by experts who are seeing the big picture and have lots of experience in this. I'm just amazed by how powerful and hopeful this all seems.
It's me. I think my glass is always half full.
Well, great. That's a great way. And are you seeing these questions from Jim Dieter? Do you want to speak?
Yes. Yeah. So let me. I see them now. So let me handle the first one, and I'll read it out loud for everyone. Are you seeing an increase in asset management opportunities from federal agencies and beyond? I think that there's probably a lull, Jim, from what we're seeing because of the infrastructure bill and what everyone's expecting, coming down the pike. I don't think that there's been a significant increase per se at the moment, because everyone's sort of gearing up for, massive change. There have been, great efforts that we have seen GSA, undertaking for electrification of the vehicle fleet and actually moving forward on these concepts. We know that we've been talking and hearing about it for the past 20 years in earnest, right? So there are people that are making efforts towards actual modernization. But I do think that, once DOT, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, EPA, have all the plans up, the execution in line with the infrastructure bill passing, that we will see a significant increase in the level of work needed to support that. And I think Brookings put out a great piece of work back in November after the infrastructure bill was passed that outlines, some of the areas to consider, because there's a lot of rulemaking that's going to go on, a lot of things in the background and policy changes that have to occur in order to actually get to the point in which you can procure and implement. So there's a few steps that we're going to see a little bit of a lag. And the second question I see is, have you had the opportunity to help customers integrate multiple asset management silos, like personal property and facilities, IT asset management, as well as fleet? I think that this is an area that's continues to be important from an overarching federal government standpoint. The way assets are managed today, because driven largely by the reporting requirements that are put out, interoperability between these different asset categories continues to need improvement, right? You still have stovepiped organizations. However, the caveat to that is that because of larger efforts around data standardization and management, the visibility of duplication, the visibility of opportunities for improvement has increased. And I'll also juxtapose, as a result of the pandemic and the realization that we are not going back to the same level of work that we had or working operations, there are significant efforts trying to essentially re-engineer how work looks today, return to work. So all of the structure of the facilities, the layout, the property that's aligned to it, the IT infrastructure are being re-examined in that light. So it's a bit of a forcing factor when it comes to getting integration of various elements of asset management together. Are we where we need to be today? Absolutely not. Right? Are we headed in the right direction? Yes. I definitely think we're not going backwards. And a lot of that has to do with the understanding that it's a new paradigm, right? As I call in from my home office as a great example.
Excellent. And I just want to reiterate something you said earlier, that, what we're talking about with the nows or sows or asset management in general is not a software. It's not a, specific data system that, you can just download and apply. Goes way beyond that, and requires the integration of probably multiple, software systems to support in a modern way. And I wanted to point that out again, because it seems important to mention for some folks who are looking for kind of an all-in-one solution. And maybe we could reference ISO 55000, but
yeah, Nick, I mean, that's a great point. I know that it's a mantra that we've talked about for some time. We're not talking about a system as in an IT system. We're talking about a system as in a system of management. And there's a significant piece, and this is in ISO 55000, of communication, of change management, and being able to articulate that value of what proper asset management does for the community, right? Whether it's a cost savings value, whether it's actually being able to address water shortages, allocation of resources, helping people from a healthcare perspective. I mean, I think what is a great opportunity for continued growth is being able to articulate that message, right? And we as a community need to be able to do that effectively, right? If you do proper asset management, then you will get X, Y, and Z. Well, you'll get better, better transportation networks, better healthcare, better services overall at a lower cost, because it's that important. So it's that communication of the value is quite frankly a campaign that we all have to work through.
Well, awesome. Thanks for shouting that from the bullhorn here for everyone listening today. Right. We have some limited time, so would you turn towards the infrastructure bill, and then maybe use that to segue into our upcoming roundtable on asset leadership and asset management influencing infrastructure spending?
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So, like modern times, nothing can surprise us anymore. Whether that's changes, pandemics, or changes in military postures overseas, and different actors around the world. I think that the infrastructure bill passing, the significant amount of change that will have on our country, and making it through the gates to realization, is a once in a lifetime event. Right. And I can't, undersell how important that is for everyone to take a step back and realize, the impact that will have on our nation. Now, it's not just about improving or maintaining what has been established today. I think there are significant goals that were set out as part of the infrastructure bill, and money put behind it that will, improve everything from water to IT infrastructure, roads and bridges, electrification, passenger rail, right? These are all elements of the infrastructure bill that holistically look at the assets in our nation and say, how do we modernize, right? How do we become more effective? We were coming at a tipping point. We're at a tipping point where infrastructure is beginning to fail. And I know Governor O'Malley had talked about, in previous years, what happens when that occurs, and that being, a terrible tragedy, for families, for hundreds of people, and we're seeing it right before our eyes, right? Surfside in Miami, and the horrible tragedy that occurred in my hometown and in my community was a stark realization for many that something needs to be done. Now, the infrastructure bill is focused on these public infrastructure networks, but there's a realization that we need to improve what we have today. Now, there's significant change that needs to occur as a result of the infrastructure bill, and there's time that it will take to essentially put those levers in motion, right? And some of those levers can be executed a little more effectively, right? Where funding is being targeted to agencies that already have programs in place, where you're bolstering those programs and enhancing them to get more resources into the general public or into areas that were needed or underfunded. And in other cases, there, like I mentioned before, will need to be new rules written, new programs set up, new policies written. And then state and local governments will have to take that information, they are today, right, and figuring out, how do I execute on this, right? So it's a monumental effort that will take thousands upon thousands of people to execute effectively. And this community here of people within asset management, who essentially are able to do that, right? They're able to integrate, and I assure you, everyone on this call or everyone that's within ALN or what might watch the recording has a point of integration that will be affected by the infrastructure bill. So those are some high level thoughts on what we can expect and what needs to be done in the near future.
Awesome. Well, thanks for those high level thoughts. And I guess my follow-up would be to just kind of, you said you often see things as a glass half full, and I also like to hear hopeful ideas and inspire hope in listeners. What would you say you hope that asset management, asset leadership has to teach and to help influence as far as spending allocations of an infrastructure bill? What sort of outcomes do you think we can influence, and how can we influence those outcomes?
Yeah, I think one of the important things that we can do as a community is leverage our knowledge of the system in and of itself, right? If you're a part of this call, you realize that asset management is a system of interrelated categories, interrelated variables, right? That combined can make asset management effective, right? We're able to leverage that knowledge of, let's just take electrification of vehicles, for example, right? We're able to leverage our knowledge, of facilities, of energy infrastructure, to determine end to end what would need to occur in order to electrify a vehicle fleet, as an example, right? We know that there's going to take significant changes to the facilities housing those vehicles, to the power grid, to the output, the investment and changes that will be needed in space. What are we going to do with unused assets from a dispositions perspective, de-retrofitting perspective? So not many people are walking into this with essentially the ability to play on the field, right? We know the field, we know the rules of the game, and can essentially execute effectively. And I think that with some of the goals that were set out in the infrastructure bill, to help communities that have been underserved, right? To redraw the maps of cities, to change transportation that has adversely impacted on communities within the United States, is a goal that we can help achieve. And since we know how to operate within this arena, we could essentially be enablers of it. So I'll sort of pause there.
And I get to take Nick's job and say, oh, thank you. And we're approaching the half hour, but thank you, Moshe, for your time and explanation. You did some very clear, concise descriptions. And Nick, thanks for stepping in. internet went wonky, and then after minute 5, everything seemed fine. I don't know what the problem was, but you did a great job. Nick, if you could, what?
I had a feeling you had almost engineered this to push me into the interviewer role.
I wish I was that clever, but if you could do the sponsors, and Moshe, I hope you can stick around for a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, just wanted to thank again our patron members and sponsors, as well as our organizational members and sponsors, because we couldn't do programs like this without Grant Thornton and other organizational members that help make this possible, including our newsletter and the upcoming roundtable. So thank you for all the organizations and all the people behind those organizations that make what we do at the ALN possible.
And speaking of the roundtable, Moshe, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was you selected Michael Demers to represent Grant Thornton in the roundtable on Monday, which is how asset leadership can help us with the infrastructure spending. And I wanted you to talk about why you decided to have Michael Demers speak.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. Well, we're very excited about the roundtable discussion on Monday. I think you put together a fantastic and diverse group of stakeholders, from GAO to Army Corps of Engineers, state and local representatives on the public side. And I thought from a Grant Thornton perspective, Michael is a senior director within our practice with immense experience on the state and local environment within asset management, very knowledgeable of the infrastructure bill. So a great balance, the representation, providing those points of view of how state and local leaders, as well as federal leaders, can take the infrastructure bill and make it happen, right? Make it effective and ensure that it's successfully implemented. So that was the rationale behind having Michael join the panel. I really look forward to it. I know that his insight is deep and great. Yeah.
Yes, I had the privilege of having a short conversation with him, and in a few minutes, he really expanded my understanding of legislation, how much is already there for asset management, and the way that state and local government has to interact with federal government for the federal infrastructure spending. So hopefully that will be the beginning of us trying to put forward our ideas about asset leadership in the rules and policy creation that you talked about. That's going to be necessary. And then we're going to be following that up with a summit in March, the middle of March, and further the discussion on making sure that the systematic approach to asset management that Nick was talking about earlier is applied to this infrastructure spending. And then the other thing that I wanted to ask you more about is the electrification of vehicles' impact on federal law enforcement. I went to a federal event in 2008 on microgrids, and somebody talked about the difference between effectiveness and efficient. And he was saying electric vehicles might be very effective, but if you're being chased by the enemy and the battery runs out, it's not very effective. So you got to have effective and efficient balance. And how do you think that'll play in law enforcement, or do you think it will?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of smart people are addressing this topic today, right? The reality is there's a lot of support functions around law enforcement that are not pursuit vehicles, right? So there are opportunities to electrify various aspects of the law enforcement fleet that should not have as great an impact on mission as say a patrol car, as an example. But there are considerations being made for hybrid vehicles, even within the pursuit sort of classification. So it's not a clear answer. There are opportunities that I think is the short answer, and headway that can be made for the overall electrification of the fleet. It's just not going to happen quickly. There's also the infrastructure that needs to come around that, right? As I was mentioning before, there's a facilities impact, there's an electric grid impact, there's a lot of other factors that need to be in play, and people are thinking through, right, and taking action on, which is further than I've seen in the past 20 years. So
that's very encouraging.
Yeah,
excellent. And since this is a group event, I'd like to ask Jim Dieter to come on. He's been around, and he might have some questions about things that Nick and I haven't brought up.
I've been around. That's a story. Been
Hey,
around
Jim.
a while. Hey, Moshe, great to see you, sir.
Good to see you too.
Hey, I had a chance to read an RFP from a federal agency. I guess I won't name it. Recently, it was for asset management, and it was due a couple weeks ago in January. But it was notable in that it was strictly facilities, and it was very maintenance oriented.
Yeah.
Yet they talked about ISO 55000, and I'm like, it looks like they're talking about an asset management plan, and they don't understand the difference between that and strategic asset management plan. So how's he going to turn that into a question? So when you're working with your clients that you work with and you're telling them about it, do you have any words you can share on how you convey that kind of a difference and what a strategic asset management plan can do for the organization?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think that the first part is educating clients on ISO 55000, what that truly means. From the facilities perspective, particularly in the federal government, most of the acquisitions are around architectural engineering services, right? Because there's so much need for maintenance, improvement, operations of these facilities, and it continues to be on GAO's high priority list. More so now as a result of this changing paradigm that we mentioned before with return to work. So how are we taking these facilities and structurally redesigning them to account for a remote or partially remote community? So I think that the first part is getting in and articulating the value of a strategic asset management plan and what that can essentially do to improve overall portfolio management. And then secondly, bifurcating what would be the more architectural engineering requirements to be focused on essentially just that. And I think there is significant value if you do bifurcate the two, because you have one with governance and planning and then one specific to essentially the tactical execution, which is a separate body of work, right? It's a separate level of effort, it's a separate skill set. So that would be my recommendation on if you're speaking with clients ahead of time, before these things come out, and say, hey, I think that this is a wise way of approaching it, because it's going to give you this strategy on one hand, and then with the governance to oversee ultimately the execution on the other, right, which is more on the A&E side.
So I came up with an analogy this week that I like. Let me try it out.
Yeah, go for it.
AMPs, asset management plans, are the arrows.
Sure.
The SAMP, or the strategic asset management plan, is the bow, and asset leadership is the archer.
I think that works. I think that works. Someone can get creative and turn that into, a GIF or something.
Yeah, there could be a real good graphic with that.
Yeah.
Moshe, I had the same reaction when I first heard that. I was like, oh, that works. Yep.
Yeah.
At first I was thinking of a gun analogy, and I thought that just isn't right. No.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Moshe, for taking an onslaught of questions from all of us. You handled us all deftly and with the plum, so no different than usual. Thank you so much. Thanks again to Nick for filling in. Jim, thanks for jumping in. And thanks to all of the people who've been listening. We appreciate you attending. Please sign up for the roundtable event on Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We're trying our first Monday program, I think. I don't think we've had a Monday program before. See how that goes. And then if you are an A55K professional, please sign up for the A55K quarterly program on Tuesday that we're starting. So thanks again.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for calling in.